My coworker locked me in a freezer in order to get promoted. I'm convinced I'm going to die in here. I spun around sharply and saw that the heavy freezer door was firmly shut. My colleague, Logan, was holding the door handle with no discernible expression on his face. That better not be locked, I said to him sternly. Of course it's not locked. It's never locked, he replied in a tone that seemed to imply I was being stupid for even thinking that it was. Oh yeah? Open it then, I shot back at him. Logan tugged on the freezer door handle and the door didn't budge. Its movement was clearly prevented by the fact that it was definitely locked. Shoot, he said, almost surprised he was wrong. Good one. I think you are now a shoo-in for that promotion. I heard they are looking for managers who locked themselves in the freezer, I angrily replied to him. At the time, Logan and I were fighting over the management position in the supermarket. I should have been convinced that I now had the job in the bag, especially after this blunder. Logan, though, was quite tenacious and would probably still try anything to get that job. And by the way, he continued, there is enough air in a standard walk-in freezer to last 24 hours, so we should be fine. I think the cold might be a slightly more pressing matter, I replied, almost condescendingly. That was the other thing about Logan. He knew lots of random trivia facts, and he was more than happy to provide you with one, even if the timing wasn't always appropriate. Well, what do we do now? I asked, as the realization of the severity of our predicament set in. I glanced up at the wall as I spoke, and read the electronic temperature gauge that was attached to it. It read -9 degrees. There's an emergency button in here somewhere. It sets off an alarm inside the store, Logan said excitedly, as he remembered that this button existed. We were working the graveyard shift and had been the only employees in the store for hours. It was 2 a.m. We figured someone would come in eventually. Besides, it was only a few hours before shift change. Nevertheless, we still pressed the button. Logan reached up and pressed the button, and as he did, I heard a faint alarm bell ringing from the shop floor. The sound of ringing that would determine whether or not we would be freed from our icy prison. Hopefully someone nearby would hear it. There really wasn't much else we could do, though. We both left our phones in the office when we started our shift, and so we were trapped here until someone heard the alarm. I watched as the breath I exhaled turned to a fine mist in front of me, and I could see the fine layer of ice that covered everything inside the freezer. The only thing I didn't experience was the cold itself. In fact, I felt slightly warm. We were both wearing thick woolen coats and gloves. Somehow, in this below-zero freezer, I was a little bit hot. Logan would never shut up and always insisted on telling fun facts. For some reason, he saw this time as a good opportunity to do so. I normally hated it, but I needed something to get my mind off of. Did you know that ostriches have 3 stomachs? He asked. No, I didn't know that. Thanks for enlightening me. If you liked that fact, you will love this, he said, and then continued to speak before I could object. I listened to him speak, confused as to why he was telling me these random facts. I was beginning to become distracted, though, as I was really beginning to feel warm. Have you heard that certain drugs like LSD raise your body temperature? There you go, another fun fact for you. Bet you didn't cane on. Hey, what are you doing? Logan changed what he was saying because he saw me stand up and take off the large woolen coat that was protecting me from the cold. I suddenly felt really warm and needed to shed the extra layers. I felt an instant rush of relief when the coat had been removed, as I felt my temperature drop to a more appropriate level. What are you doing? You really are going to freeze if you take that off, Logan said, sounding concerned for my well-being. Don't ask me how, but I felt hot, I replied. Hot? You're crazy. I was about to respond by asking him to feel my arm to see if it felt warm or it was just in my head, when I looked down at my arm and saw a small hole. I studied it closer. There was a rather tiny hole in the crease of my elbow, in the same spot they usually draw blood from. In fact, I think this is what it was. It looked as if the hole was caused by a needle. Do you see this? I called out to Logan as I outstretched my arm. That small hole right there? Logan took a step towards me, inspected my arm for a minute, and then nodded. Yeah, looks like you've had a blood test, he said. And speaking of blood, did you know that a pint of blood contains 2.4 trillion red blood cells? I haven't had a blood test, I told him, ignoring his useless fact. And that is when it dawned on me. I had no recollection of entering the freezer. All I remembered was that I was throwing away some rotten meat that had small maggots in it. And the next, Logan was closing the freezer door. The rest of my memory was a total blank. I suddenly knew what happened. Now that I think about it, at that time, this was a little extreme of an accusation. You drugged me, I said to Logan accusingly. I'm sorry? What? Yeah, it makes sense. You drugged me, then locked us in the freezer. Then when we get rescued, you can blame it on me and insist they drug test me, or... No, surely not. A dark thought crept into my head. I knew Logan would do pretty much anything for this promotion, but surely not this. I felt delirious. I felt like I was going crazy. You were going to leave me to die in here. You will be rescued, and you will claim you tried to save me, but you couldn't. Then your competition is out of the way, and the promotion is yours. Logan stared at me in confusion and disbelief. Maybe disbelief at what I was saying, or disbelief that I had worked out his insidious plan. You're paranoid, he replied after a moment. I didn't drug you. What the hell are you on about? Someone will hear the alarm soon and we will be saved. We will both be out of here soon. I looked at him, trying to figure out if he was telling the truth, or if I was correct. Then why did you tell me that fact about the drug that raises your body temperature? Why did that fact pop into your head? I yelled at him, realizing that more and more pieces were starting to connect. Because that's what I do. I tell random facts. I don't know why I told you that one. It's just something I thought of. He spat back at me. I watched him intently, and I could see his anger level rising. I noticed this because I saw a few veins in his neck begin to stick out. My eye was drawn to the rather large vein that was now poking out his neck. The vein then wriggled. I jumped backwards. "What the hell was that?" I yelled. "Your vein just moved." As I spoke, I saw the vein wriggle once more. It looked like it was a small blue snake that slithered slightly along Logan's neck. I took in a few deep breaths and tried to rationalize the situation, and I quickly found an explanation. "I'm hallucinating, aren't I? Whatever you gave me is making me see some weird stuff." Logan just looked at me like I was losing my mind, which was entirely possible. Then I felt a strange wiggling sensation down my own arm. I moved my focus towards it and saw two of my own veins wriggle just below the surface of my skin. I felt them move too. Whatever drug Logan injected me with, it was really beginning to take effect. I watched both my arms as the veins inside them moved around, like small worms in the dirt. I felt each movement, but I had to keep reminding myself it was just the effect of some hallucinogen. Then, breaking my concentration from my arms, I felt my nose start to run. This made my brain realize that I was still stuck inside the freezer, and that the cold would be a danger to me. I sniffed, and felt whatever was running out my nose return to where it came from. The fear inside me grew. I was stuck in freezing temperatures, drugged, and now hallucinating as well. I didn't have much hope that I would survive the night, and Logan was to blame. I looked up at him, and saw the worried expression on his face, but lunged towards him anyway. I refused to die without a fight. I grabbed Logan by the arm and was just about to push him forwards, when I felt his veins slither below the palm of my hand. I recoiled and let go of him. His face now showed signs of pure terror. I looked at his face for a moment, when I saw the thing slide out of one of his nostrils. The long, pure white worm was about a foot long, and it slid out the end of his nose and dropped towards the ground. I screamed at the same time that Logan did. He opened his mouth and let out a loud, ear-piercing scream, and as he did, another worm slithered out of his mouth. My nose started to run again, but I didn't have time to sniff it back up. The long, ghostly pale worm crawled out of my nostril and fell to the ground. Whatever these things were, they were inside me too. I was too scared to even scream as I looked back down at my arms and saw all of the wriggling. I now knew exactly what they were, and they weren't my veins. I felt more and more the worms begin to slide out of my nose, and a couple out of my mouth. I looked to Logan and saw that the same thing was happening to him too. Click. The freezer door slid open, and I saw a puzzled-looking customer staring at us. His face changed from one of confusion to pure fear as he saw what was happening to the both of us. The last thing I saw before I blacked out was a large group of the parasitic worms all crawled and slithering towards the terrified man. This was just over a week ago now, and I am still recovering from what happened. There are small holes covering almost my entire body, created by the things escaping. The doctors say we'll be okay, that the parasites are all out of our system. They would always look concerned talking to me. I don't know why. The holes are healing, but I can still feel the wriggling under my skin sometimes. It's just my imagination, they assure me. But whatever I was injected with, it caused this. It caused all of this. The other night in the hospital, I saw one of the nurses staring at my chart. She looked pale and worried. Before I could ask her anything, she hurried away. I couldn't help but wonder what she saw there. A few days later, I noticed a small wriggling vein on her neck. She looked puzzled when I pointed it out. I think she thought I was still hallucinating. I wasn't. The next day I saw her again. This time she had more holes than I did. It was meant to distract me, just like all his other facts. But now, every time I close my eyes, I see thousands of tiny eggs ready to hatch, and 1,000 little worms squirming beneath the skin of everyone in the city. I would always wonder what happened to Logan, where he was now. Until one day, he showed up in the hospital to see me. "Hey buddy, long time no see. Good news, I got the job." I remember staring at him in bewilderment, as he was the only person I could see aside from the plain white walls behind me. As he was about to leave, he went up into my ear to whisper something. "Did you know parasites can lay thousands of eggs at a time?" It terrified me. I tried screaming, tried pulling the worms out of my skin as Logan walked away. I wasn't sure if it was the worms or the straitjacket that the doctors gave me, but I wasn't able to move my arms. My brother was left to die in the woods. When he came back for revenge 15 years later, I'm convinced it wasn't the same person. And the worst part was, it was my mother who left him there. We lived somewhere rural, so my mother thought she could get away with it. There were 3 of us kids, and none of us were fathered by the same person, and I for one never met the man she had me with. Her 3rd baby was born in a crummy trailer parked in the middle of nowhere with nothing but dirt and dust around. I swear I can remember hearing her scream when she birthed that creature. Benjamin is my half-brother, but it's not like that ever made me see him in a different light. He's my big brother and we've always been close. Ben and I are 5 years apart. I don't know how old we were exactly when our mom died, but we still live in that trailer of hers. It's just standing somewhere else now. For a long time, I didn't know where our younger sibling was either. Neither my brother nor I were keen on finding out. I guess we'd assumed his father had collected him after Mom had left him in the woods and ran off with us. We thought we'd never see him again. It's been over 15 years since it happened. We hadn't expected him to ever come back to us. Yesterday night, Ben and I were sitting in the trailer going through my material together. I was preparing for the job interview I had scheduled for the following morning, and very much stressing out over it. Ben had to remind me not to pull on the hairs on my arm every few seconds. It's what I do when I'm nervous. If we had the time, I'd make you get your arms waxed, he threatened me. It was then that we heard the first scream. It came from outside, somewhere behind the tree line. I winced at the sound. It was high-pitched and loud. I think if someone had been to skin a live animal, it wouldn't have sounded any different. Ben wasn't as fazed as me. He just shrugged and told me it was probably a fox in heat. You've heard them screech before. Always spooked you, he told me. They shouldn't be around until January though, should they? I asked. What do I know? Maybe this one's early. Who cares? It's nothing. Keep reading. I grumbled a little but looked down at my papers again, until the next scream followed. I jerked my head up and more determined this time I said, That is not a fox. Ben sighed deeply. You want me to take a look? I nodded and he grabbed his shotgun and opened the flimsy trailer door. It was dark outside. Eventually I stood up and walked over to peer outside, just as Ben came in. He almost ran right over me. I backed off and he shut the door, putting the chain in place before sitting down. There's nothing there, he told me in a calm voice. Still, I couldn't help but notice that he was keeping his shotgun close. A deep frown was creasing his forehead. Something wasn't right. I was relieved for the most part. I put my papers aside and got up, informing my brother that I was going to turn in for the night. He was barely listening. Instead, he kept staring at the door with that same frown on his face. He looked like some kind of statue and hardly appeared to register what I was saying. I was concerned, sure, but fatigue outweighed my worries and I disappeared behind the screen, dividing the bedroom from the rest of the trailer to change clothes and lay down. I woke up because of a weight pressing down on my back. I was lying on my stomach with my face buried in the pillows. How I managed to even breathe was beyond me. Either way, someone was sitting on my back. They were heavy, but not heavy enough to be my brother. I knew if he'd been the one sitting on me, I wouldn't have survived to wake up in the first place. They were emanating a smell of manure and wet fur, strong enough for me to stifle a gag. I had this sinking feeling in the pit of my stomach, like I was in the process of realizing the danger I was in, but not quite there yet. My heart was pounding in my chest, and my mind was racing. But I didn't dare to move. I tried to keep my breathing steady despite me having broken into cold sweat already. I shut my eyes, attempting to relax my whole body just so I'd stop trembling. Where was my brother? Where was Benjamin? That's the only thing I could think of. I knew whoever was on top of me had to have gotten past him to get to me. He was a light sleeper. He would never let anyone simply get inside like that. Bit by bit, the memories of the previous evening came trickling back in. What time was it? 1 or 2 in the morning, maybe? I was just lying there, listening to this person's slow, raspy breaths, until they suddenly started vocalizing. It was like they were putting sound into their breathing, the result being a low, hoarse growl. I winced, gripping the bedsheets with the hand that was hidden beneath the blankets. The breathing hitched and the weight on my back shifted. I pressed my eyes shut even tighter and tensed up, attempting to mask my shaking. Then suddenly, I felt something graze my neck. It felt like bristles, mixed with hot, reeking air hitting my skin. Hello, big sister. The voice came out mangled and distorted, like somebody playing a recording of somebody talking in reverse. I felt a sharp yank on my hair as he pulled me off the bed. I landed on the floor, the impact knocking the air out of me. I had played dead for long enough. I flung myself onto my back and kicked blindly into the air, my naked foot meeting with something warm and soft and furry. I had hit his belly. This didn't stop him for too long though, as I felt his hand in my hair again, gripping it and forcing me to sit up. Not knowing what else to do, I screamed my older brother's name. Look at me! The creature above me hissed, right before slapping me in the face. What do you want? I whimpered. In the sparse light of the trailer, I couldn't quite see him. I did make out his silhouette though, tall and broad, with something large and warped on top of his head. It didn't look right. I tried to remember his appearance from when he was only a baby, but my head was empty. Maybe I really had been too little. Instead of responding, he wrapped his arms around my chest and picked me up, dragging me out the door. I struggled and flailed around, trying to hold on to anything I could reach, but eventually giving up and letting him throw me into the dirt outside. What do you want? I repeated, tears in my eyes. You left me to die, he growled. What? I whined. What were we supposed to do? We were kids. I was a toddler. It was Mom who... My voice broke off again. Can you blame her? She couldn't have. You left me to die. You could have stopped her, he shouted. In the light of the full moon, I could finally see him clearly. He looked even worse than what I'd imagined. He was covered in thick matted fur from his waist down, and he had the inverted legs of a goat. His arms ended in malformed hands that looked like his first and second as well as third and fourth fingers had grown into each other, 2 long black claws protruding from each of the pairs. I don't think he had any thumbs. His head was the least human thing about him. It looked almost entirely like that of a ram. How he managed to form any comprehensible words through that snout was beyond me. The silhouette of the 2 large horns on his head stood out against the sky. I'm sorry, I yelled, getting on my hands and knees in an attempt to crawl away from him. My sides were burning with pain. I let out a cry of agony when he stomped down on my foot from above. Please, I sobbed as I rolled over, shielding my head with my arms as he bent down to see eye to eye with me. His hands snaked their way past mine, and he wrapped his long, twisted fingers around my neck. I whimpered when his claws scraped my skin. Tears were running freely down my face as he began to choke me, his grip on my throat hard and painful. Everything was already getting dark when suddenly, the pressure on my throat vanished. It just disappeared. Released from my little brother's hands, I slumped over and immediately began inhaling, coughing and gagging while trying to steady my breathing almost like a fish on land. There was some kind of murmur filling my ears. When I could finally see clearly again, something large fell down next to me. It took me some time to register this, my grasp on reality as fragile as it was. I felt something warm and wet on my cheek. Then I felt it on my arms too. It was hard to make out at first, but judging from its smell and color, I could soon tell that it was blood. The next thing I realized was that it was everywhere. It didn't just stain my arms and face. It was on my clothes, on the ground below me, and even in my hair. I looked up to see Ben towering above me. There was no blood on him though. He pulled me up and wrapped his arms around me, gently stroking my back. "It's okay," he whispered. "He's dead. It's all right." I turned to look at the dead body lying in the dirt, but Ben reached up and placed his hand on the back of my head, carefully yet firmly keeping it in place. "Please don't look," he said softly. I took a deep, shaky breath. "Where were you?" "After you fell asleep, I went back outside to... Well, I thought it was him when we heard the screams. I had to deal with him somehow, and I didn't want to frighten you. In hindsight, I guess the only reason he announced himself like that was to lure me out so he could... I don't know why he'd start with you. I'm just glad he couldn't finish it. I'm so sorry. I should have paid closer attention to you. I should have never left you alone in there. Do you think his father will come for us? I'd like to see him try. What about... I'll ask my old man to get rid of him. I'm telling you, when you get up in the morning, it'll be like none of this ever happened. Now let's get you inside, okay?" I sighed and nodded, obediently staggering back inside the trailer with the broken down door and climbing into bed, still in my dirty, bloodied clothes. I didn't mind. I simply wanted to rest. I knew Ben's dad was no good in the grand scheme of things, but he'd always been good at fixing things for his son. He'd clean up the mess if Ben asked. I was shaken and beyond exhausted. Thankfully, I fell asleep the instant my head met with my pillow. When I woke up, my pajamas were clean. The streaks of blood I had expected them to leave on the sheets were nowhere to be seen. I grabbed my cell phone and took a quick look at myself through the camera. There was not a single bruise on my neck. I slid open the screen to find my brother sitting at the small table with a bottle of lemonade in one hand and an open book in the other. Upon noticing me, he looked up with a wide smile. "Morning," he said. I gave him a lazy grin in return and nodded at the fixed trailer door. "So your dad was here already?" "Yeah, you missed him yet again. I mean, it's not like he stayed very long, but, you know." He shrugged and lowered his head, focusing on his novel once more. "Did we really leave him to die?" I asked. "We didn't. We were literal children. It was Mom's call. Besides, it was sort of my father's fault in a way. He told her it was either him or me, and she chose me." He looked up at me with a little smirk on his face. "You can only look after one type of circus freak at a time, I guess." "I'm kind of sorry for him, aren't you?" "Nope." His grin grew wider. "Not one bit." "Did you get your gun back?" "Not yet." He took a sip of his drink. "I don't really want it anymore. I know I creep you out sometimes, but I think you need to let me be myself a little more." I fell silent, looking down at my feet. "Come on, it's not like I'd ever hurt you." He sat aside his book and walked up to me, offering me his lemonade. I declined and he took another sip. He then spread his arms, offering a hug, but I turned away a little. He sighed, dropping his arms. "Come on," he tried again. "Please just get the shotgun back. Do what you want when I'm not around, but please. I don't want to see that again," I murmured, fiddling with the hem of my shirt. "Okay." He sounded happy again. When he opened the door and hopped outside to stretch, there was a little skip in his step. I guess no matter how much I try not to think about it, my brother is the way he is, and someday, he'll be just like his father. Then him and I will have to part ways. You can't change things like that. It's sad though, especially since he's the only family I have left now. Mom only had us three after all, a boy, a girl, and the devil, just not in that order. But just as I heard a rustling in the bushes in the back, I heard that distant familiar noise, a scream that sounded similar to what I heard last night, but worse. It was Ben. He was the one screaming. A shotgun blast followed his screams, and all grew silent. I froze. I didn't know what to do. I didn't move, I didn't speak, but someone else spoke to me. "It's all your fault." The devil brought me back to life. He gave me a mission to murder my enemy. When I went to hell, I knew exactly why. "Well, Tony, if you hadn't shot these two guys back when you were 20, it would have probably done a lot in your favor." "I know what I did," I replied. "Thought so, but I have to be clear with everyone who goes down here. After all, we need to find a fitting punishment for you." "Uh-huh, what do you have in mind?" I asked as I sat down in the office chair across from him at his gesture. "Think, long and hard. 2 mothers lost their sons thanks to you." "It was self-defense." "It wasn't. You didn't need to shoot them in the chest. A bullet in the knee and they would have gone down either way. They didn't have any weapons. They were coming at you, but it wasn't a fair fight. Either way, you did change your ways, didn't you?" A fond smile crept its way onto my lips. "When I met Maria..." The man in the dark suit raised his brows, Yes, right. Your dear wife Maria, a virtuous lady with a heart of gold if there's ever been one. Yeah, Maria's great. Was. My condolences. The second these words had left his mouth, I felt my chest tighten. My heart must have stood still for a moment. Was? I repeated. You've been waiting for a long time, Tony. You didn't notice, of course, but we are really busy most of the time. You died 10 years ago on the spot, so happy anniversary, I suppose. The sad thing is that in the meantime, something truly unfortunate happened to your mourning widow. Did she remarry? I inquired. No, that's not it. He slammed the folder in front of him shut, suddenly a relieved smile on his face. But this actually made me come up with a great punishment for you. He rose from his chair and held out his hand to me. I did the same and shook his offered hand. He cleared his throat. For the pain you have caused to loving people and for the lives you have taken, you shall witness the person you yourself loved most of all being wiped from the face of the earth. I swallowed hard. I couldn't think of anything I would like less than to watch my wife suffer. But he was right. It seemed adequate. I deserved it. Even more so, something deep inside of me had to know what had happened to the love of my life. A dread-filled, nervous, frightened kind of curiosity. The man in the black suit led me into a dark room with only a chair and a large screen inside. He sat me down on the chair and proceeded to strap me down into it. Once I was seated, he reached out to touch my face and pushed up my eyelids. When he let go, I noticed I was unable to squeeze them shut again. Don't worry, your eyes won't dry out, he promised. All you have to do is watch, and then I'll let you close them again. I sighed and nodded. Fair. Ready? The man produced a small remote control from his pocket. I took a deep breath and directed my eyes up at the screen, bracing myself. Yes. The man patted my shoulder and pressed a button on the remote. The screen buzzed and came flickering to life. I could hear the man leave the room and shut the door behind himself, locking it with a click. My heart was pounding in my chest as I stared up at the monitor on which an image had appeared. It displayed a familiar scene. Our neighborhood, the street on which we'd lived before I died. It was dark and the moon hung high up in the sky. And there she was, Maria. She looked older than I remembered, but not by much, and she hadn't lost one bit of her beauty. The silvery moonlight was shining down onto her brown locks, which were flowing down her slender shoulders as gracefully as ever, and tears were shimmering in her large, dark, round eyes. She quickly wiped them off with one hand, the other clutching the shopping bag she was carrying. And then it happened. As she rounded the corner, she bumped into someone. She gasped and dropped her shopping bag, spilling oranges, eggs, and a bag of flour onto the ground. A slew of apologies on her lips, she bent down to pick it all up. She hurriedly shoved the items back into her bag and stood back up, only to find herself eye to eye with the muzzle of a gun. My heart sank, and judging from the look of sheer terror on her face, so did hers. The man pulled the trigger just a split second later. I watched as Maria, the woman that had made my life worthwhile, who had cherished and loved me despite my past crimes, who had showed me a different side of a world that had treated me with little else but disregard at best and cruelty at worst before the day she had stepped into my life, fell to her knees. By the time her lifeless body hit the ground, I was screaming so loud I thought my lungs could have burst. The man took out a small Polaroid camera, snapped a picture of the scene and turned to leave. He didn't pick up her purse nor her bag. He simply walked off, a smile on his face as if he was pleased at just having snuffed out the life of an innocent, unsuspecting pure soul, as if he hadn't just stolen what could have been decades of healing from her loss, and enjoying her time on earth from her. Tears running down my cheeks, unstopped by my frozen eyelids. I yelled at the screen, at the man, at the corpse of my wife. Finally, the lights of the moving picture faded to black, and the screen turned off. I could hear the man in the black suit come in behind me. He walked up to me and loosened my restraints before gently wiping over my eyelids. They fluttered shut instantly and I blinked a few times, getting used to the feeling again as the tears kept streaming down my cheeks. I swallowed, looking up at him. Where is she? I asked breathlessly. She's in limbo. She'll go to heaven for sure, but for now, there's too much turmoil in her soul for her to find release. Send her up there now, I demanded, wiping my red, swollen eyes. Not that easy, I'm afraid. It's her soul, Tony. It's inside of her. He sighed. She'll have to calm down first. It might take a while. She's dazed, confused, at complete odds with her sudden death and far from acceptance. Suddenly, he perked up like he had just had an idea. Of course, I suppose we could. Help things go their natural way a little. We could? How? Whatever it is, I'll do it. Anything. There's only one thing that'll help the soul of someone who has suffered injustice at the hands of another. Do you know what that is, Tony? Forgiveness? I offered pathetically. Haha, no, revenge! See, there's one big advantage you have by having been sent here, and that is that once you've received your punishment, you're free to go. Well, not exactly free, but free to do as we tell you without being tortured. Noticing the disbelief on my face, he rolled his eyes. That's how it works. You come down here, we make you repent, and once we think you've had enough, we send you forth to get us some new sinners. And this guy, he's got a top spot on our list. You may have noticed that he didn't murder Maria for her money or possessions. He did because he wanted to, and he's done it before. He enjoys it. I let out a shaky sob. The man in the black suit held out his hand to help me up. So Tony, how about it? Are you going to avenge your dearest departed? This time it truly would be the right thing to do. An eye for an eye. I could feel my face harden, and I placed my hand in his and let him pull me to my feet. The man in the black suit guided me back to the elevator I had found myself in after awakening, the one I had descended in. We stood side by side in the small cabin when an unsettling thought came to me. How do I know you're not just screwing me over? I asked. I have absolutely no need to. All I want is for this man to be down here. He chuckled a little. Oh, the things I'm going to do to him. The things I'll make him do. His voice trailed off. And you want to take revenge for Maria so she can move on. We both have our motives in the open, and I swear by my good name that your maneuver will not be in vain. And your good name is? Son, I'd have to mutilate your vocal cords for you to pronounce it, he replied with a laugh. And what good is a name you can't speak out loud? Just trust me on this. I mean, it's not like you got much of an alternative. I'll trust you then, I muttered, hoping I would not be regretting this decision anytime soon. I will give you what you need most in this world you are about to return to, a body. But that's all I have. You'll need to find a weapon and a way, but since the will is there already, I'm confident in your success. He motioned for me to turn to him, and I did, giving him a questioning look. The apartment you'll find yourself in is his. I'm not sure if he's home, but let's hope he is, and you'll manage to catch him off guard. One more thing, you need to be over with it by sunrise. That's when I'll take you back here. Good luck. With that, he pressed both his palms to my temples, and I felt my eyes flutter shut, only to see a set of completely new surroundings upon opening then again. I was standing in a kitchen, facing a fridge right next to a small stove. My head was spinning, and I had to grab onto the counter behind me in order to stay on my feet. Looking down on myself, I recognized the clothes I was wearing. The same jacket and pants I had worn when I'd had my accident. They were even still torn in places. I could feel my own crusted blood rub against my skin from the inside of those parts that hadn't been ripped apart but should have. Still, my body was whole. Ignoring the disgusting feeling of dirty clothes and the aftertaste of my own death that hadn't seemed to have happened this long ago, I began to look around. The block of knives beside me looked promising. I grabbed a hold of the longest one and pulled it out, considering it. It certainly wouldn't be easy, attacking with such a large, clumsy makeshift weapon, but with a bit of luck and his potential surprise acting in my favor, I figured it had to do. Trying not to make any sound, I proceeded into the adjacent room. I held still to listen to any possible noises, but all was silent. The idea that he really wasn't home began to sink in. Of course, that would complicate matters a bit, but at least it gave me the time to look around. When I saw that the bedroom door was open just a crack, I slid in. Remembering the photo he took of her body, I began to go through the drawers. I was sure he was keeping a stash of them somewhere. My search came up with nothing at first, until I tripped over a tiny elevation in the ground. A loose floorboard. How original. I bent down and used my nails to dig it up before lifting it from its place. There was a yellowed envelope hidden in the small space I had just uncovered, stained with dust and the marks of time and use. Its opening edges were frayed. I picked it up to take a look at it. As expected, there were photos in there. Lots of photos. I counted 12 in total. I couldn't bear to look at that of my wife, but I did pay attention to the 3 that followed hers. I assumed they were in some sort of chronological order. If that was the case, then the later victims had suffered a lot more at his hands. These last 3 hadn't been shot. They had been stabbed to death, each one apparently with more ferocity than the last. It was sickening. Once I couldn't stand it any longer, I continued looking around. Needless to say, I found his laptop and decided to make use of it. He's not home yet, but it can't be long now. I know he's not expecting me. I'll wait behind the door for the bastard. He won't even see it coming. It'll be quick and clean, or at least quicker and cleaner than he would deserve after what he did to them. To her, who knows what the man in the black suit's plans for me are for after that. Maybe I should be scared, I don't know. That's where I'm at right now. And that's all. I put the photos back into the envelope and placed it on the table, in plain sight for the cops to find when they'd come to investigate what I imagine will probably be quite a stank after a few days. I guess you guys are going to hear some about all this in the news soon. Or maybe they'll cover it up, who knows. But if the authorities do find him, and if they do find the photos, then there'll be people out there knowing why there's a dead man's fingerprints on it. Besides, my initial demise came so quickly, I couldn't even think about it too much. If I'm being honest, I went into writing this expecting it to turn out to be some kind of goodbye letter. I guess that's just not my thing. This is all right though. This will do. A man has lived under my bed for my entire life. Today was the first day he asked to sleep with me, and now I have the sudden urge for us spooning each other in bed. His eyes are golden. They look like that of a toad. They shine in the darkness. That was the first thing I saw of him, 2 glowing dots shimmering in the pitch-black space under my new bed. Being curious, I got on all 4s and crept up to the bed to look underneath it. However, my eyes were only met with utter darkness, as if the only light able to reach the space underneath the bed was this odd golden shimmer. I frowned in confusion and reached out to poke one of the dots with my finger. It felt like jelly. Ow! I gasped and backed off, quickly pulling my arm out from under the bed. When I had calmed down a bit, I looked around. I was all alone in my room. Pressing myself to the floor again, I stared into the blackness. Hello? I stammered. Hi. The same voice. It was deep and rugged but not unpleasant. It sounded rather nice, actually. Are those your eyes? I whispered. Yes. Ooh, sorry, I didn't mean to hurt you. It's okay, you didn't know. I hummed quietly. You have very pretty eyes, like a toad. The voice from under the bed chuckled. Thank you. So, I'm Mel. Who are you? I asked, extending my hand under the bed once again for a handshake. However, instead of fingers, something warm and furry wrapped around it. It felt almost like a dog's tail. It tickled my palm a bit and I giggled. I'm your older brother. Are not, I puffed. I don't have any brothers, no sisters either. Am too. Mom and Dad just never told you about me. Why not? The voice from under the bed sighed. Because they hate talking about me. So much so that they will get very angry if you ever mention me. After a short pause, he added, We don't want that to happen, do we? I shook my head. So how much older than me are you? I'm not sure. A couple 100 years maybe? I snorted. You're lying. You can't be that old. You'd be dead. And yet I'm here. But Mom and Dad aren't even that old, I argued. How can you be their son if you're older than them? It's complicated. I could explain, but, not in the mood for some long-winded story. I puffed my cheeks. Fine. So what's your name? My name? I'm afraid I don't have one. You can give me one, though, if you'd like to, my brother replied. I'll call you Jasper, then. I like that name, I said. A low chuckle came in response. I think I do, too. The next day, I didn't mention Jasper to my parents, or any other day for that matter. At first, it was because I didn't want them to get angry. However, my interactions with my older brother soon became a thing of such intimacy that I didn't even want to tell them about it at all. I would talk to him about everything, even about secrets I didn't even share with my mom or dad. But my brother wasn't exactly easy care. I always had to feed him. He wasn't happy with the small portions and tiny snacks I was still able to steal for him. After the third time I only brought him an apple, he really began to complain. Can't you get me anything more meaty? This won't do. I'm so hungry, he moaned. I'm sorry, I said truthfully. Why don't Mom and Dad ever feed you? Don't they know you need to eat? Jasper didn't respond. A short pause ensued, neither of us saying a word. I felt terrible. Suddenly, he spoke up again. His voice was low and foreboding. Could you do something for me, Mel? Could you leave the window open tonight? I nodded hesitantly. Why, though? No answer. Still, that night I did as he told me. I figured maybe he simply wanted some fresh air. I didn't want to upset him either, after the food I had brought him had been so disappointing. I loved my brother after all. That night, Jasper told me a goodnight story before I fell asleep. The morning after that, he was gone. I noticed when I woke up and greeted him, he wasn't answering to me. I figured he just wasn't up yet. It was Sunday, so I didn't have to go to school or anything. My parents seemed to still be asleep, so I quickly ran down into the kitchen to grab a couple slices of bread. I took them upstairs and slid them under the bed for Jasper. Instead of him immediately gobbling them down, though, they remained untouched. Jasper, I uttered. Wake up, I got you something to eat. Everything was silent. I started letting my hand travel around in the darkness but was unable to find anything. That's when it finally sank in that he wasn't there. I never stopped waiting for Jasper to return. Every morning I'd check under the bed, clinging onto the sliver of hope of seeing his two glowing eyes again. I would leave the windows open every night, even if the cold air seeping in through them would make me shiver. Days of waiting turned into weeks, weeks into months and months into years, and eventually I must have been around 13. I gave up. I left my secret brother behind, and with him all the times I had cried myself to sleep, caught a cold because of the open windows, and checked the space under my bed in vain. It was around that time I began to doubt his existence in its entirety. I figured Jasper had been nothing but an imaginary friend, a specter a lonely child's mind had conjured up and discarded, once it had grown useless. Deep down I must have known I was merely lying to myself, but I liked this conclusion better than the alternative. Believing I had gotten rid of something of the same worth as a once-beloved childhood toy was better than knowing I had been abandoned. The missing person reports and cases of people being found mauled in the surrounding neighborhoods simply didn't register with me. I didn't suspect a thing when my parents suddenly started getting reluctant to let me leave the house on my own. Curfews were placed on our small town. Policemen and women patrolling the area after dark became a common sight. I think I understood somewhere in the back of my mind that these abductions and violent attacks had reached our own neighborhood. But as I said, it simply didn't register. That only changed when I was 16. I would always catch a ride with a friend of mine who went to the same high school as me. Her name was Ruth, and she was kind enough to drive by my family's place every morning to pick me up. The last time I saw her was early on a chilly day in fall. I climbed in on the passenger side and wrapped my arms around my backpack, which was resting on my lap. I exchanged a few words of greeting with Ruth before we set off. She had to drive very slowly and carefully due to the fog, causing us to arrive at school about 10 minutes late. I thanked her for the ride, as always. She said it was no big deal, as always. And then our ways parted in the main hallway. That was the last time I saw Ruth. Apparently, Ruth had wandered off to the back of the school building to sneak a cigarette during the last break. When she hadn't returned to her classroom, though, a teacher had sent out another student to go look for her. They found the remains of her body behind the school gym in a pool of blood, next to her bag, a lighter, and a box of smokes. This was the final straw for my mom and dad to decide to leave our hometown. We moved to a suburban neighborhood pretty far away. I had to change schools, but that wasn't too much of a bother. Ruth's death had left me frightened and sad. She had been a close friend of mine for years. I had simply wanted to get away from it all, I guess. The new place was nice. It's where I graduated, got my first job at a gas station, and my first apartment. Living on my own was great. I remember I enjoyed it from the very start. I was doing okay for myself. I was fine. Until everything changed this morning. I had the night shift at work yesterday. It ended at around 3 in the morning, which is when I headed out. The sun wasn't about to rise yet, so the streets were dark and empty, apart from a group of 4 guys who were walking ahead of me. They looked pretty young, and all of them were wearing those jackets you'd see on members of high school sports teams. They appeared to be pretty drunk, more stumbling along the sideway than actually walking, while grabbing each other by the arm from time to time to keep their balance. To be honest, I thought it looked a little funny, even though I felt bad for them. They seemed to be pretty out of it. I stayed behind them, keeping my distance. That meant I had to walk rather slowly, but that was fine. I only had to get back to my car after all. I would always pull up next to the entrance of the city's park. When the first trees came into sight, I let go of a quiet sigh of relief. I couldn't wait to get back home. The 4 drunk guys were still more or less blocking my path, but I knew it wouldn't be long now. We were about to pass a large maple tree when something dropped from its cave of thick foliage and landed on the ground, right in front of the 4 young men. At first, I didn't even understand what was happening. It was the boys' screams that tore me out of my trance. My eyes fell onto the creature that had been hiding in the maple tree. It was enormous, but with the way it pressed itself to the ground, it took me a second to notice its full size. It was almost gliding across the street as it stalked towards the 4 youths, its head lowered menacingly. Its black fur was gleaming in the faint light of the street lamp shining down at it from above, and its long, thin tail was whipping the ground behind it. Its mouth opened to reveal too many rows of jagged, sharp teeth, the shape of which reminded me of a broken glass bottle. It let out a low, rumbling growl, finally prompting a vocal response from the 4 guys and me. They let out screams of terror, but as my voice rose to join theirs, the shriek died in my throat. It had been in that very moment that I saw its eyes. They glaringly stood out from the rest of its bestial black body, 2 glowing, warm golden orbs, like the eyes of a toad. I stared at him, and Jasper stared back. He slowly proceeded towards me, but there was no menace in his gaze anymore. The 4 young men stumbled apart, almost like they were making way for him, only to run off. Jasper rose to his full height. He was towering above me. If it hadn't been for his demonstration a few moments prior, I wouldn't have believed him to ever have fit under my bed. Maybe he had grown since the last time I'd seen him as well. I felt tears form in my eyes. "It's you?" I uttered, my voice barely above a whisper. He didn't say a thing. It was then that I admitted to realizing what I had probably known all along. The day I had released my big brother from my room, I had unleashed his hunger onto innocent people. I wondered for how long I had been carrying this feeling around in the back of my head. "Please," I began quietly, trying to keep my voice from breaking. But Jasper interrupted me. His mouth didn't open when he began to speak, but I could hear him in my head. "I'll be back for you soon. We will sleep together tonight." With that, he suddenly turned and dashed off into the darkness of the park, leaving me by myself as he disappeared between the trees. I was alone again, standing underneath the flickering streetlight. I wiped the tears from my eyes and slowly, with shaking steps, made my way over to my car. I drove home in complete silence, not even listening to the radio. I'm not sure what Jasper will do when we meet again. I'm of course well aware that he might eat me. I don't really think he will, at least I hope not. Then again, I know he might not be the same as all those years ago. I want to try and convince him to stop these attacks. Maybe I could get him to move into the woods or something so he'll feed on animals. But to be honest, most of all, I just want to talk to him. If he won't be here for that, I guess I can still comfort myself with the knowledge of being able to properly feed him at least once. All this time, all I had wanted was to be his little sister again, no matter how insane that wish might have been. Now that I know I'll see him again, I'm so incredibly happy. I know I shouldn't be. I know anyone who reads this will think I'm mental, but I can't help it. I'm so happy I could die. I mean it. My teacher has been giving us some strange assignments. Last night our homework was to sacrifice ourselves to the devil. I don't think my life will ever be the same. By me forgetting to turn in my assignment, I was the sole survivor of my class. When it all started, I was a horrid little girl. I refused to do my homework. I never spoke up in class. I didn't study for tests and did everything in my power to irritate and gross out anyone around me. I didn't care if I got punished. I wouldn't have cared if they'd have thrown me out altogether. I'm not saying this to make my kid self look like some sort of badass. I suppose this was also what moved me to refuse working on Mrs. Tucker's fall project. It wasn't too big a loss. Nobody ever liked Mrs. Tucker's tasks, or the woman herself for that matter. She had the meanest, darkest eyes, and to top it all off, a big black wart sat atop the tip of her crooked nose. If anyone was the she-devil, it was her. Christ, I was scared of her. I still remember sitting in the very back of the classroom, keeping my head low and my eyes half shut, trying my hardest to fall asleep during her lesson. Despite managing not to look at her, I couldn't block out the rattling sound of her voice. It was high-pitched and overly gentle, and about as pleasant as the noise an unoiled door hinge would make. "Hanny." I heard her call my name, but pretended like I hadn't. "Hanny." Crap, she was coming over to my desk. Her chunky heels were clunking on the linoleum floor. I felt her gnarled hands on my shoulders. "Don't touch me, you creepy hag," I hissed, not turning around nor raising my head. "Now, Hanny, that wasn't very nice." Her hands dug deeper into my shoulders like she was massaging me. I shuddered. "I said, get your paws off," I grunted. Mrs. Tucker withdrew. "You really ought to follow the lesson, Hanny. Don't you want to learn what our new project is all about?" I most certainly did not. "Hanny? Eat poo, lady." Mrs. Tucker let out a deep sigh. I heard her returning to the front of the classroom, and my heartbeat finally slowed down again. There was no use in trying to sleep anymore, though. I'd most certainly have some kind of nightmare about those gross fingers of hers if I did. My eyes shut. I listened to her door creak voice explaining the task she intended to send us home with. "Now, for Halloween we want to make something special. This holiday is not just about eating candy, it's about celebrating fall and embracing winter. Isn't that exciting, darlings?" No response came from anywhere in the room. Mrs. Tucker cleared her throat before carrying on. "I want all of you to pick the last flowers you can find around your homes and dry them between the pages of a suitable book. Then collect enough acorns and chestnuts to each make a neat little doll out of them. You may paint your doll and decorate it with the dried flowers. Make sure to write your name on it. On Halloween you'll bring all the dolls to school with you and we'll decide on who's got the best one. My, won't that be fun, children?" Silence. Mrs. Tucker hummed. "Well then, this assignment is due on October 31st, and I'm expecting a lot from you, my darlings. You've got all the time in the world, so really put your soul into this artwork. Just this once you'll try hard, won't you?" I would have never admitted this, but the idea of crafting such a doll actually appealed to me. Therefore, I decided to take a stroll through the woods near the schoolhouse that same day. I kept my eyes peeled for flowers, but try as I might, I found none. Colorful leaves rained from the trees as their branches were shaken by howling gusts of wind. The stinging cold and the eerie sounds may have scared me if it hadn't been for the frosty yet bright sun shining down on me from a cheerfully blue sky peppered with white, fluffy clouds. At least there were plenty of ripe chestnuts. They were gleaming in the tall, wet grass by my feet like deep brown diamonds. I began to pick up a few, but soon got extremely bored with the task. Frustrated, I started hurling the ones I'd collected against a big black rock to see if they'd break. Once I had thrown all my chestnuts, I went over to the rock for an assessment. Sadly, these poor man's diamonds had exploded the way I'd hoped they would. I did discover something else, though, something a lot more interesting. On the other side of the rock, there was a drawing done in white chalk. It was unlike anything I'd ever seen before, and the only way I can describe it was that it resembled a much embellished star with weird, indecipherable letters around it. I knelt there for a little while longer, pondering on the symbol's meaning and origin. Flighty child that I was, however, I soon lost interest and went on homewards. The day of Halloween was a school day, one that promised to be particularly awful at that. Mrs. Tucker watched us trickle into her classroom with a wide smile on her face. I showed up late, as per usual, and sat down in the back only to instantly slouch and place my head in my palms. I hadn't slept well the night before, so all I wanted at that moment was to take a nap. How was I supposed to egg houses that coming night when I was this tired? To my dismay, Mrs. Tucker had apparently intended to have her idiotic chestnut doll competition outside. "All right, kids, pack your things. We're taking a little walk into the woods. This weather we're having is just grand, isn't it? Oh, we'll have such a jolly time." I didn't bother to stifle my sigh of disappointment. I contemplated simply staying in my seat as an act of protest, but I didn't have the energy to start that big an argument, so I ended up obediently trotting along with the others. Mrs. Tucker led us away from the schoolhouse and into the adjacent forest. Shuffling through the underbrush, her hunchbacked form resembled a big moving tree stump. The clear, breezy open air had an invigorating effect on me, helping me ignore my listlessness. Trudging through the weeds and the mud, twigs snapping beneath our feet, we followed her until she came to a halt in the exact same spot I'd been to after she'd announced the project. I instantly recognized the rock that had the chalk symbol on its backside. I quickly rounded the large stone to check, and sure enough, the drawing was still there. It even appeared to have been freshened up not too long ago. Something about this seemed fishy to me. Sure, it could have been a coincidence, but I simply had this feeling that Mrs. Tucker was up to something here. "All right, children, place your bags in a neat little row right over there by the mount. We don't want them getting dirty now. Please grab your dolls and line them up around this rock here. Don't dawdle." I could tell my classmates were just as confused as I was. Some whispered among one another, others exchanged doubtful glances. Nevertheless, they each started producing their contributions to the project and placed them around the rock at random. Mrs. Tucker seemed all too pleased. "Lovely," she proclaimed. "Now please turn around and close your eyes while I take a look at these." I recognized my own bewilderment in the faces of my fellow students. This was getting absurd. A mere few did as they were told. The others just stared at the teacher in confusion. "Turn around," Mrs. Tucker suddenly barked, causing all of us, even myself, to obey. My heart was racing. I couldn't believe how afraid I was all of a sudden. I was in some way deeply aware that something was going terribly awry. The wind picked up, growing colder and fiercer as it blew our hair into our faces and raised dead leaves from the forest floor, making them twirl and dance as it carried them along. "Lord and Master, hear my call!" Mrs. Tucker cried out, her voice warping and lowering in pitch until it sounded like something straight from hell. "Lord and Master, know my heart." I froze. I literally froze. I couldn't move anymore. I could blink and breathe, but I couldn't lift a single finger. I couldn't even open my mouth. Fear gripped me as I struggled against whatever force was holding me in place. I soon realized it was futile, though. The wind turned into a howling storm. Through its whistling, I almost couldn't make out what our teacher was saying. "I offer you these 19 souls, small and pure and ripe for your taking, by the dolls they have fashioned in their likeness, and by their names that they've carved into the fruits of your trees. Their souls are yours for the taking." My heart was drumming, my blood singing in my ears. I was starting to get a grasp of the situation I was in, beginning to understand what this wretched old hag was trying to do to us. One thing I knew for sure, I did not want to see what it was she was talking to. 18. The voice of the creature didn't sound like it came from one single mouth. It was all around me, booming through the woods as though it was being blasted at us through a dozen hidden speakers. 18? Mrs. Tucker repeated in an alarmed tone. What do you mean? 18 dolls for 18 souls. You've promised me more than you're able to give, my priestess. What? No, it can't be. All of them were... That's when I realized it. A wave of energy surged through my body, and suddenly overcome with bravery, I whirled around. I only dared to look at Mrs. Tucker. Her sight alone was enough to reintroduce a sense of dread into my steeled heart. Her hair was standing on end, hovering around her head like a dirty, drizzly halo. The whites of her eyes had swallowed her irises and pupils, and her mouth hung wide open, like that of a snake with its jaw unhinged. There was something hovering above her, something big that was casting a long shadow onto the ground, but I couldn't find the strength to look up. Somewhere deep down, I knew I needed to protect my young mind from what I would see if I did. Instead, I firmly held my teacher's hateful glare. She had apparently put two and two together at the same time as me, spun around and was now facing me, her twisted grimace expressing both anger and panic. She could tell that her plan had gone wrong, that I had come between her and whatever she'd been meaning to get out of all this. "You disgusting, rotten little brat!" she bellowed, squatting like a beast of prey about to pounce. "Do you have any idea what you've cost me?" She jumped and I staggered back, but to my utter shock and disbelief, she began to dissolve. Her face began melting, bubbles forming under her skin that grew and then popped, leaving liquidated pink flesh running down her bare skull. She was still in midair when her body crumbled entirely. What was left of her hit the forest floor with a splat. My mouth agape, I stared in horror at the decomposed heap of organic matter that had once been Mrs. Tucker. This was her last chance, you see. Her efforts were never fully successful, never calculated nor thought out. I have no use for a priestess with lacking devotion. I still didn't look up. In fact, I might as well have remained frozen from the start, for I didn't dare to move a muscle until the shadow had disappeared, and I heard the other kids gasp and stumble around as they returned to their senses. It took us a long time to convince our parents of what had truly happened that day. But when you've got 19 kids all saying the same thing in a weird rock in the woods, it's hard to brush stuff like that off, even if it sounds tad outlandish. So they did away with the big stone. I don't know where to, but I never saw it again. We got a new art teacher too. She was a similarly boring but definitely less creepy lady, and that's the whole story. Of course, it encouraged me to live the way I do nowadays. I don't work, mooching off friends and family at every possible opportunity. Don't judge. I'm being lazy out of the goodness of my heart. Who knows, I might save the world someday if I keep at it. I woke up on a barreling train heading nowhere, and I think I'm going to die soon. If you come looking for me, the same will happen to you. It's now midnight. I just boarded the train. My phone battery is at 92%. The train is cramped. There's hardly any available seats at all, which I hate because now I have to sit next to somebody. I choose the spot on the left side of the guy who looks like he's been ripped from a Western movie. He's already fast asleep, and that's what I'm hoping to be in just a bit. Writing this down because typing helps me unwind. It's 12:26. There's just been a loudspeaker announcement. The first one since I boarded, which is kind of weird. Normally, those come up every time a train arrives at or leaves a station, don't they? Anyways, the voice was really strange, all deep and choky. I couldn't understand what the guy was saying at all. I'm having trouble falling asleep. Thought I'd be out like a light in a matter of seconds, so I'm a little disappointed. It's 12:51. I forgot how long the train ride is actually going to be. I keep trying to pull up my online ticket on my phone, but I can't seem to find it anywhere. Battery's at 83%. I'm texting with my mom to pass the time. It's 12:55. Mom doesn't remember I was going to board this train tonight. I was so sure I told her. She asked me where I was headed and if this was for work or something, and get this, I didn't know what to tell her. I literally don't know. Where even is this train going? Why in the world am I here? I don't know if I'm amused at my own stupidity, or if this is something I should be concerned about. I'm not drunk or high or anything. Is this what brain damage looks like? It's 12:59. I've been trying to ask around to figure out where the train is going, but nobody's telling me anything. I'm freaking out. I don't know what to do. I can't find anything about it online either. Something's very wrong here. The guy next to me still hasn't woken up. Battery's at 67%. It's emptying a lot faster than before. I can't find my charger. I don't know if I even had it with me. It's 1:02. I have no luggage. I can't remember packing. I can't remember waiting at the station. What the hell is happening? It's 1:25. A new passenger got on. At least she claims she only just boarded now. I actually don't know how because the train didn't stop. She just walked into our wagon. She's shaking and crying and she was looking for a seat. She's not talking to me exactly. She's simply standing in the aisle, rambling and sobbing. It's 1:38. I'm crying too by now, as loud as the other girl, if not louder. I'm terrified. The train isn't going to stop. I can't get off anymore. I think I get it. I don't want this. I want to get out. I want my mom. God, no. What did I do to deserve this? It's 1:56. The guy next to me just woke up. He's been stirring for a while now. I think I'm keeping him awake with my weeping, so I grab him and I go, "Help me, please, for the love of God, help me." And he says there's nothing he can do. He asks for my name, and I tell him it's Julie, and he tells me he's Jack. He goes, "Julie, you gotta calm down. Either you calm down or you end up getting thrown off the train. You don't want to get thrown off the train." So I ask, "What happens when you get thrown off?" And he says you'll never get to the final destination, but you can't go back either. I ask if there is a way back, and he just shakes his head no. I don't want that to happen. Not to me or anyone. So I start trying to calm down this girl. But it's really difficult. She keeps wailing and thrashing around, and I tell her that I get it because I'm scared too, but she won't hear it. She literally just hit me, square across the face, so I think I'll stop now. It's 2:37. The girl got thrown off. There was train staff, 2 of them, and they grabbed her and just dragged her away. I don't know where to. I tried to follow them, but Jack held me back. He says that I'll lose my internet connection soon, because we're almost there. Arrival is scheduled for 3 a.m. It's 2:56. I've spent the last couple minutes texting my mom. I tried to call her too, but it's not letting me. So I sent her a voicemail and she sent one back. She was a little confused because I kept telling her how much I love her. She's up really late for me and she says she'll go to bed now. So I sent her another goodnight voicemail. I hope she keeps it, for when she misses me. I've listened to hers over and over again, and her voice is as sweet and comforting as always. I have to turn my phone off now. It's nearly dead anyways. Jack is still awake. We're going to the same place, so I guess I'll just keep talking to him. He's very understanding, actually. He's just been on the train longer, so he's had more time to deal with it all. We're both looking forward to getting off the train by now. And now, it's 10 a.m. This is going to be really hard to explain. 7 hours ago, I woke up in a hospital room. Some guy T-boned my car and apparently things were looking dire for me. I was unresponsive. In fact, the medical staff thought I was gone for good. Here's the thing. I found these notes on my phone. The stuff I shared above. I swear I don't remember any of this stuff. My mom only just got notified of my accident and she's on her way here. I already went through our chat history and the texts and voicemails I've been describing. They're there. It's all there. It was all written while I was out cold. Doctors fighting for my life. There should have been no way for these notes to come into existence. I can't believe it. I don't know what to make of this. That is, I do know, but the implications are just too much for me right now. And then I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. A small red mark on my arm in the shape of a ticket, with the words "Final Destination" etched on it. In horror, I pull up the sleeve of my hospital gown to reveal the tattooed image of a train, the same one from my notes. A chill ran down my spine. Suddenly, the hospital room door creaks open, and standing there in the doorway is Jack. He's not wearing a patient's gown, but the uniform of a hospital staff member. A name tag on his chest reads, Dr. Jack. He flashes a menacing smile at me. "Welcome back, Julie," he says, the same choky voice I heard over the loudspeaker on the train echoing through the hospital room. "We've been expecting you." As the room fills with an unnatural darkness, the last thing I hear is the sound of a train whistle, fading into the distance. I discovered an old cabin in the woods. I wish I never entered it in the first place. I wish I never went hiking on that day in the first place. That tape not only ruined my childhood, but I don't think I'll ever be able to live a normal life again. For context, I'm an avid hiker, and I go after this hobby whenever I can. I mostly just drive out to this hilly stretch of woodland that's about an hour away from where I live. There are a lot of different signposted trails there, and even though I've taken all of them at least once before, I don't mind doing it again. When this happened, I was hiking up a longer path. All the trails go around the forest in a loop, so you'll come back out right where you started from. The one I chose involves a pretty steep ascent, so it's slightly more challenging than some of the others. It made me sweat a good deal, but since it wasn't my first time, I was doing just fine, until it started raining. The weather forecast had predicted nothing but a cloudy sky and mild temperatures, so this was completely out of the blue. It was a strong kind of rain too. Before long, the water was whipping in my face and coming down hard. I needed to get myself somewhere dry or it'd start kneading me like dough. Of course, I hadn't brought an umbrella, so I ended up running into the woods for cover. For a while, I crouched down under a big tree, and it did shield me from the rain for a few minutes. I figured I could wait it out, but then there was this loud cracking noise behind me, and I turned just in time to watch a huge branch break off another tree and crash down below. Without me noticing, the wind had picked up and was now causing the bushes and treetops to shudder violently. Then, all of a sudden, I remembered there was an old abandoned cabin off to the side a little way up the trail. Hopeful once more, I began to jog, shielding my eyes from the falling water with my hands as I looked around trying to locate the small wooden building. Finally, I spotted the structure in the distance and started making my way up to it. Praying that it wasn't locked, I rattled on the doorknob. The door swung open with an obedient creak, and I staggered inside before slamming it shut behind me. Turning my attention to the windows, I found that one of them was broken, but had been pieced back together with duct tape. I tentatively gave it a poke with the tip of my finger, which it withstood. I hoped it would outlast the storm. The sound of thunder rolling came from outside, and I flinched at how loud it was. I really had been lucky to have made it to the cabin in time. I was hesitant to get comfortable on the couch for fear of the tiny life forms that might have taken up residence inside it over time, but it still beat sitting on the floor. So I sank down on the saggy cushions and took out my cell phone. Of course, I had no reception whatsoever. At least I had some offline games to play while I was waiting for the storm to die down. After half an hour, I realized that wasn't going to happen anytime soon, though. I would have to go easy on the battery if I wanted to have some left by the time I got out of there. So I sat aside my phone and started looking through my backpack for something else to keep myself busy with. I found a worn novel I had crammed in there and forgotten ages ago, so I started reading. I still had a bunch of snacks and water, so I ate and drank until my stomach felt pleasantly full. The wind was howling outside, and I kept hearing thunder clapping. The sky was growing darker too. I noticed that it was getting harder to read with how little light was finding its way into the windows. This concerned me a bit, and I wondered how long exactly I would end up stuck in the cabin. Things were looking pretty grim out there, and I wasn't too keen on spending the night in a place like this, even though it did feel kind of adventurous. I continued to read for as long as what remained of the day's light allowed me, but that was hardly another hour. The hut looked spooky in the darkness. It wasn't exactly pitch black, but enough to make me uneasy. The only thing to illuminate the living room was the occasional flash of lightning from outside. I moved over on the couch so I could watch the storm through one of the windows. Thunder rolled once again, and then, all of a sudden, a male voice cut through the silence left in its wake. 7, 6, 11, 5, 9, and 20 mile today. I jolted upright. For a second, my head had just gone completely empty. Then I glanced around frantically, before realizing that nobody had actually spoken to me. The voice was deep and eerily resonant, but it had a crackly undertone to it. It was a recording, but my relief upon realizing this was short-lived. There was a strange recording playing somewhere nearby, somewhere close to me. Somebody had just turned it on. 4, 11, 17, 32 the day before. The recording stopped. It had only been playing for mere seconds, but I could tell that it was coming from downstairs, from the basement. The abrupt way it had been turned off made me think that whoever was down there had only turned it on accidentally. They'd never wanted me to know I was not alone. It was only then that I realized I was still sitting on the couch, frozen in place like a statue, staring at the basement entrance. I instantly jumped to my feet and picked up my jacket, struggling to put it on while at the same time trying to shove my belongings back into my backpack. I had to get out of there. I didn't care about the rain or the lightning or the falling branches anymore. I just needed to get out. Then I heard footsteps. They were hasty, fast, and they were moving up the stairs. Stifling a scream, I abandoned my backpack and simply burst through the door, sprinting out into the cold. Despite the darkness, I could see the trail ahead, just a small distance away from the cabin. I leapt towards it, and when I'd reached it, I just kept on running as fast as my legs would carry me. I hurriedly patted down my jacket. I could feel my cell phone, wallet, and keys in my pockets, which immediately made me feel light with relief. There was also a can of pepper spray somewhere in there, which I figured was better than nothing if, God forbid, whoever had been in the cabin would catch up with me. Thankfully, it never came to that. By some miracle, I found my way back to my car. I instantly locked it upon jumping inside. I was completely drenched and utterly exhausted. It took me ages to catch my breath. I sat in the car for around half an hour, shaking and crying, before finally managing to pull myself together. Realizing I shouldn't hang around, I started driving. I was way too tired to make it all the way back home, so I just stopped at this dingy little motel that's 15 minutes away from the hiking spot and got a room there for the night. I basically collapsed on the bed. I didn't know whether or not to call the police. I've had some bad experiences with the local authorities before, so I decided not to, at least not right away. It's a trust thing, I guess. What I did was I called my brother and told him everything, asking him if he and I could go back to the place together to see what was up with it. He readily accepted, and we came up with the following plan. My brother, being a huge guy himself, would come to pick me up in the morning with one or two of his friends, and we would return to the woods as a group so no one would try to mess with us. We'd go up to the cabin, retrieve my lost belongings, and take a look at it. But I also had to promise him that if we were to find evidence of something bad going on there, we'd call the cops. He showed up in his truck the following day as promised, with another man with him. We headed back to the hiking spot and made our way up the trail. The storm had left its impact on the woods quite clearly. Broken branches were scattered everywhere, and some of the young, thin, and more fragile trees had been knocked over completely, basically torn out at the roots. The cabin, however, had endured. Its door was wide open when we reached it. We entered it one right after the other. I could tell the guys were just as nervous as I was. No doubt they were taking what I told them quite seriously. Still, we were all prepared to defend ourselves if someone was to charge at us unexpectedly. My backpack wasn't in the upstairs room, which to me could only mean that somebody had moved it. When my brother said we'd have to go down into the basement, I was understandably reluctant at first, but he reminded me that we had agreed on this earlier, so it was too late for me to chicken out. Each stair let out an agonized creak as we put our weight on it, and I feared the rickety old things really would end up breaking down. My brother's friend stayed upstairs so he could get us out in case that would really happen, but to my surprise, it never did. Soon enough, we found ourselves in a room that was just as big as the living room. There was enough light falling in from upstairs for us to see everything, and what we saw was not nice. First, there was the tape recorder. It sat right in the middle of the floor, like it had been propped up for us to find right away. My brother went up to it and turned it on. I flinched as I heard the same warped male voice start to speak. It sounded just as eerie as before. My brother's friend suddenly called out to us from upstairs. "Is that Boots?" "What do you mean?" I asked. "That's Boots. It's this poem by Rudyard Kipling, I think. I don't know who did that reading, but it's creepy as hell. I heard it's used to simulate torture or something, like for Navy SEAL training. I don't know." By the way, it really was Boots. That's why I don't feel the need to transcribe the recording here exactly, since you can just look it up. That was the first thing to give us a really queasy feeling, though. While the room was largely empty, a single cardboard box that had been pushed up to the wall stood out. My brother took a look inside without touching it. Then he waved me over. Upon bending down beside him to check it out, I found that it held several rolls of duct tape, a bunch of plastic bags, some cable binders, and a lot of small gardening tools, like a little hoe, secateurs, and a saw. We also found cleaning supplies in another corner of the room, right next to two buckets with plastic lids on top. The second I opened one of them, a putrid smell came wafting out, strong enough to send me and my brother reeling backwards. I cursed and immediately covered my nose and mouth, hurriedly moving in again to shut the damn thing. But in my haste, I knocked it over. We stumbled aside as viscous brown and red liquid spilled onto the floor at our feet, feces and blood. "Oh no, come on, we're getting out of here," my brother yelled, grabbing me by the wrist and starting to drag me back up the stairs. That very moment, however, something caught my eye out of a darkened corner of the room. "Wait," I told him, pulling my hand out of his grasp and pointing at what I had just seen. It was my backpack, hung up on a nail jutting out of the wall. How had I not noticed it sooner? I had to cautiously step over the pool of blood on the floor to reach it, but eventually, I managed to grab it, and then leapt back over to my brother. We ran up the stairs and left the cabin with our third companion, and as soon as we were back in the car, he called the police while I began to rummage through my backpack. Everywhere was how I'd left it. Nothing had been taken out. There was something else, though. I found it tucked between the pages of the book I'd been reading. It was this torn-off piece of paper with a brief note scrawled onto it. Just a few words, but enough to make my stomach turn. "Come back tomorrow."